Save my child, and I will reward you with myself, the Apache widow said to a retired cowboy. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Silas Ward spent most of his days in quiet routines that kept his thoughts steady. He lived alone on a small stretch of land along the northern edge of the New Mexico territory, far from towns and riders who carried trouble with them. The cabin he built after leaving trail work stood beside a dry creek bed that only held water after rainstorms, and the open land around it gave him enough distance from people to ease the pressure in his chest that came whenever memories of his brother rose without warning. He had left the trail guard life 3 years earlier, after watching the cattle drive ambush that took his brother's life. Since then, he had chosen simple survival, repairing fences, tending 2 horses, keeping his food stores in order, and avoiding anything that forced him to feel more than necessary. That was his mission now: stay alive, stay quiet, and keep the past from swallowing him whole. He was working along the fence line that afternoon, testing each post with a slow shove, when he noticed a shift in the usual stillness. The light stretched long across the dry grass, and the creek bed held only dust. At first, he thought the movement at the far end of the property was a stray animal finding shade, but the shape didn't match the way animals moved. It was too upright, too deliberate, too weighted. He straightened, keeping one hand resting on the fence rail, and watched without speaking or stepping forward. Years on the trail had taught him that reacting too quickly toward danger or need could end badly. The figure drew closer at a slow, uneven pace. As the distance narrowed, he saw a woman carrying a child, not slung over her shoulder, but held close as if his weight barely registered. The woman reached level ground and paused, breathing heavily through her nose, her shoulders pulled tight from strain. She was Apache, dressed in worn deerskin that had torn at the hem, her bare feet scraped raw from long travel. Her hair, once neatly braided, had come undone in places, sticking to her face with dried sweat and dust. The child in her arms hung limp, his head resting against her collarbone without strength of his own. Silas felt a pressure in his chest that had nothing to do with fear. He had seen sick children on the trail before, fevers that burned fast and took lives before anyone had time to understand what went wrong. He recognized the signs immediately, and a quiet dread moved through him as he studied the boy's shallow breathing. The woman stopped a few paces from the fence. Her knees shook slightly, but her posture stayed straight. She held her son with a protective grip, as if surrendering him would mean more loss than she could bear. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the flat tone of someone who had run out of choices. "My son is burning," she said. "He will not live the night without water, shade, and a place to lay down." She didn't ask for help. She didn't fall to her knees or soften her voice. She simply stated the truth as she saw it. Then she added the part that made Silas's jaw tighten. "If you save him," she said with the same controlled tone, "I will give myself to you." Silas felt a brief flash of anger, not at her, but at the world that pushed a mother into speaking such words. He understood what desperation did to people, how survival stripped everything down to trades and consequences. The pain in her voice wasn't visible, but he heard it. It cut deeper than shouting ever could. He didn't answer. He didn't trust himself to speak without letting emotion he didn't want her to see slip out. Instead, he turned from the fence and walked toward the cabin with steady, measured steps. He pushed the door open and moved aside, just enough for her to follow. It was the closest he came to giving permission. The woman hesitated only long enough to adjust her grip on the child before stepping inside. Silas lit the small oil lamp on the table, its glow catching the rough texture of the cabin walls. He set out a folded blanket near the stove, the warmest place he had, and filled a cup from the kettle cooling beside the hearth. He wasn't sure how long it had been since she last drank water. Her lips were cracked, and her hands trembled from exhaustion, but she focused only on the boy as she lowered him onto the blanket. She brushed her fingers across his forehead, checking for signs of awareness, but the child didn't respond. Silas knelt beside them and placed the damp cloth gently across the boy's skin. The heat under his touch confirmed the urgency. He lifted the child slightly, so he could swallow a sip of water, careful not to overwhelm a body already fighting to hold on. The woman, Tala, though he did not know her name yet, watched every moment with attention that showed she was ready to intervene if he harmed her son, but also ready to collapse if she stopped paying attention. Her arms twitched each time the child shifted. Her eyes tracked Silas without fear, but without trust either. Silas didn't speak unless necessary. "Hold him upright," he said quietly. She did. As the boy swallowed again, a faint tremor passed through her arms. It was the first sign of relief he had seen from her. Tala's gaze kept drifting between her son and Silas, as if trying to understand why a man would help without asking for immediate payment. He sensed her confusion, but he didn't address it. He had no interest in collecting on an offer made from fear. He checked the boy's breathing again and listened to the weak rhythm of air moving through his chest. The fever was high, but not past saving. The child needed water, rest, and constant cooling. Silas sat back on the wooden chair beside the stove, elbows resting on his knees, and watched the child with a focus that pushed everything else aside. He had spent years learning to keep people at distance, yet the sight of a struggling child stirred something old inside him, something he thought he had buried the day he lost his brother. Tala lowered herself beside her son and whispered to him in Apache, her tone steady even as her fingers dug into the blanket beneath them. She didn't ask Silas for reassurance, didn't request guidance. She simply stayed alert, ready to act if her son's breathing changed. Silas kept his eyes on the boy, but he was aware of the woman too. How she carried fear under strict control, how she refused to break down, how she stayed upright despite exhaustion that would have dropped most people. Outside, the land settled into dusk, and the last light drained from the yard. Inside, the cabin held a tense quiet that belonged more to survival than comfort. Silas didn't question why she came this far alone. He didn't question why she trusted a stranger. He didn't question anything except the boy's breathing. That was all that mattered now. And as the first hour passed, he made a silent decision he didn't voice. He would not let the child die here, not if he could prevent it. Not again. Not another life lost because he hesitated or held himself apart from the world. He reached for more water. The night stretched ahead. Nothing about this moment belonged to his old mission of solitude anymore. Whether he wanted it or not, everything had already changed. The lamp burned low as darkness settled around the cabin, turning the single room into a narrow island of light while the land outside faded into black silence. Silas Ward stayed seated beside the stove, his boots planted firmly on the floorboards, his eyes fixed on the child who lay wrapped in the blanket. The boy's breathing shifted between shallow and strained, and each uneven rise of his chest kept Silas alert in a way that left no room for fatigue. Tala remained on the floor next to her son, her legs folded under her, her back straight despite exhaustion pulling at every part of her posture. She had not eaten since arriving, had not rested her head for more than a moment, but her attention stayed locked on the child. Every slight twitch of his fingers made her lean closer. Every soft sound pulled her shoulders tighter. She kept her hand on his sternum, counting breath after breath to confirm he was still fighting. Silas stood to add another piece of wood to the stove, the quiet scrape of the fire iron breaking the stillness for a few seconds. The new flame brightened the room just enough to show the sharp tension in Tala's jaw and the way her eyes had reddened from strain. She wasn't crying. She hadn't cried once since stepping through the door, but the weight behind her silence was unmistakable. He dipped the cloth into a bowl of cool water and wrung it out with slow, practiced movements before placing it back across the boy's forehead. The temperature hadn't dropped yet. It made him uneasy. He'd seen fevers break after steady care, but he'd also watched them climb too fast for any man to stop. Tala noticed the hesitation in his hands. "Is he worse?" she asked, her voice steady but tight. "Not worse," Silas said quietly, "but he's holding too much heat." Tala pressed her palm against her son's ribcage. The warmth beneath her hand deepened her fear, but she smothered it, burying the reaction before it reached her face. She had survived raids, winters without shelter, and the slow loss of her husband. Panic served no purpose now. Silas could read the strain in her posture more clearly than she realized. It reminded him of the way mothers on the trail guarded their sick children, refusing to step back even when they were at the edge of collapse. He poured a small amount of cool water into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Try to give him a little more," he said. She lifted her son's head carefully. The boy's lips parted, and a few drops of water slipped inside. He swallowed weakly, then sagged back in her arms. Tala lowered him to the blanket with careful precision, as though any sudden motion might cause him to slip further away. Silas moved the chair closer, his expression tightening with controlled frustration. He disliked uncertainty, and the child's condition left too much room for it. He had no medical training beyond what trail life forced him to learn, but he knew the importance of steady hydration and preventing overheating. Hours passed with no sign of improvement. The cabin darkened further as the lamp dimmed, and the only sound came from the stove's low crackle and the uneven breaths of the child. Tala kept whispering soft words in Apache, guiding her son to stay awake even though his eyelids fought to close. Silas noticed her hands shaking. "When did you last rest?" he asked. "Before sunrise yesterday," she replied without looking away from the boy. "You're running on nothing?" he said. "I stay until he stands again," she answered, as if stating a promise rather than a belief. Silas didn't argue. He understood the resolve driving her. He had felt its weight before, when he tried to save his brother in the aftermath of the ambush. That memory struck him with sudden clarity, the shattered breath, the blood-soaked dirt, the helplessness, and he tightened his jaw, forcing the image back down. Tala's son stirred suddenly, his body tightening as a tremor passed through him. Tala leaned over him instantly, one hand steadying his chest, the other brushing his hair aside. Silas dropped to his knees and pressed his hand to the boy's head. "He's fighting the fever," Silas muttered, watching the small muscles strain. A few moments later, the child gasped sharply, then relaxed again, his body going limp but not lifeless. Tala exhaled with an unsteady breath she had been holding for far too long. Silas grabbed another cloth and soaked it in cool water. "He needs the heat pulled out," he said, pressing the cloth gently against the back of the boy's neck. "If he can make it through the night, he has a chance." Tala closed her eyes briefly. It was the first sign of her losing control, but she pulled herself together quickly and lifted her head again. "Tell me what to do," she said. "I do all of it." Her voice didn't plead. It commanded. Silas respected that. "Keep his head up. Make sure he swallows when he can." She obeyed instantly. Minutes stretched into hours. The night deepened until the window showed nothing but black. The fever didn't break, yet the boy's breaths became slightly more even. Not enough to claim safety, but enough to ease the immediate fear of losing him before dawn. Tala adjusted the blanket around him and looked at Silas for the first time since the tremor. "You did not accept what I said earlier," she stated, not confused but trying to understand his motives. Silas leaned back against the chair, running a hand through his hair. "Your offer came from fear," he said. "That's not something a man should answer." Tala turned the words over in her mind, studying him as if he were a language she had only just begun to learn. She expected demands, conditions, some sign of the price he intended to collect. Instead, she saw restraint, focus, and something she hadn't encountered in a long time: genuine concern without hidden terms. The realization unsettled her far more than any threat would have. It forced her to reevaluate the man sitting across from her. Silas returned to tending the fire, keeping it steady enough to warm the room without overheating the child. His movement stayed controlled, purposeful, never careless. He had settled into a role he hadn't filled in years, a caretaker rather than a wanderer. By the time the first thin blue light of dawn crept across the window, the child was still breathing, still fighting, still present. Silas stood beside the blanket, watching the faint rise and fall of the small chest. "He made it through the worst part," he said in a low voice. "Not finished, but the danger isn't as sharp now." Tala rested a hand on her son's cheek, and for the first time since arriving, some of the rigid tension in her posture loosened. Silas opened the door to let the cool morning air sweep through the cabin. The worst night was over, but the days ahead would demand just as much strength. And neither of them knew yet how deeply their lives had already become entwined. The first light of day slipped into the cabin in a thin wash of pale blue, touching the wooden floorboards before reaching the small shape under the blanket. Silas Ward stood near the open door, letting the cool air settle across the room in slow currents while Tala watched her son's breathing with eyes that had not closed once throughout the night. The change in temperature stirred the boy, not sharply, but enough for him to shift his hand, a small motion that tightened Tala's throat and pushed a tremor through her shoulders. Silas stepped closer, careful not to disturb either of them. The fever hadn't vanished, but the boy's face held more color than it had hours earlier, and his breaths, though shallow, came with steadier rhythm. That alone made Silas's chest loosen, a feeling he didn't show outwardly, but one that surprised him in its intensity. He had built a life around avoiding attachments, yet the fear of losing this child had struck him harder than he expected. Tala brushed her son's cheek gently with her fingertips. "He hears us again," she whispered, the words carrying relief and disbelief mixed together. The boy's eyes fluttered open for a second, just long enough to recognize the shape of his mother's face. Tala leaned forward, pressing her forehead lightly against his. The contact steadied her breath in a way nothing else had since arriving. Silas fetched clean water from the bucket near the door and poured a small amount into a tin cup. "Try a little more," he said, setting the cup beside her. Tala lifted her son and guided the rim of the cup to his lips. He took in a careful sip, swallowed, then reached weakly for her wrist as if grounding himself. Tala cupped his hand with hers, unable to hide the sharp rush of emotion from seeing him respond. Silas watched quietly, feeling the pressure in his chest tighten again. Not from fear this time, but from the weight of witnessing something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope made him uneasy, yet he couldn't deny its presence. When the boy fell asleep again, Tala eased him back onto the blanket and stood slowly. Her legs wobbled, and she caught the edge of the table to keep herself upright. The long hours without rest and the constant vigilance had drained her strength past its limit. Silas moved closer. "You need food," he said in a firm yet quiet tone. "Your body won't hold if you keep going like this." Tala didn't argue. She couldn't. Her face showed exhaustion so deep that even pride had no room to speak. Silas took a small pot from the shelf and filled it with leftover broth from the night before. He heated it on the stove, stirring the contents with slow, steady movements. Tala watched him work, observing the precision in his hands and the way he focused on each detail. "You lived alone for a long time?" she asked. He nodded. 3 years. "Why here?" she continued, not out of curiosity, but the need to understand the man who had just spent the night fighting for her child. Silas hesitated. Talking about himself never came easily, but avoiding the question felt wrong now. "Quiet land," he said, "far from people, far from trouble." Tala studied him with a calm that held no judgment. "You lost someone," she said. It wasn't a guess. It was recognition. Silas stirred the pot one last time and set a bowl in front of her. "My brother," he answered. That was all he intended to say, but the memory pressed harder than expected. "Ambush on a cattle drive. I couldn't reach him in time." Tala didn't offer condolences. She simply nodded, acknowledging the pain without trying to soften it. She ate slowly, taking each spoonful with controlled movements. Her body needed the nourishment, though her mind stayed sharp, watching her son and evaluating every change in his breathing. When she finished, she set the bowl aside and rose again with more stability than before. Silas stepped outside to check the water barrel behind the cabin. The morning air carried a faint chill that brushed against his shirt sleeves, and he looked across the land with practiced caution. Nothing moved along the creek bed. No tracks marked the dirt. No signs of riders or scouts. He returned inside and found Tala gently adjusting her son's blanket. She looked different in the daylight. Still guarded, still alert, but with a shift in her expression that came from seeing her child alive after a night that could have ended in silence. "You said he needs shade and steady air," she said. "I want to bring him outside later." Silas considered the idea before answering. "Sheltered spot, near the fence, gets morning breeze. We could try it when the sun rises fully." Tala nodded, grateful for the option, yet unwilling to show how much it meant to her. The boy stirred again, his hands moving aimlessly until they brushed against Tala's arm. He murmured a faint, broken sound that barely carried across the room, but it hit her harder than any cry. Silas crouched beside them, checking the boy's pulse with gentle pressure. "He's gaining strength," he said. "It's small, but it's real." Tala let out a shuddered breath she had held since before dawn. "You did this," she said quietly. Silas shook his head. "He fought. I only kept him steady." She studied him again, this time with a different kind of calculation. Not the wariness she carried upon arrival, but the careful observation of someone trying to understand a man whose actions didn't match the harshness of the land. Silas rose and stepped toward the door. "I'll bring in more water. You stay with him." Tala reached out and touched her son's chest, grounding herself in the steady rhythm of his breath, her own fears easing for the first time since she fled across the territory. The child's survival was no longer uncertain, but the path ahead, what she would face, what she would decide, was becoming more complicated with each moment she spent under Silas Ward's roof. And neither of them yet understood how deeply the coming days would bind them together. The morning settled fully over the land by the time Silas returned from the water barrel with a full pail balanced against his hip. Inside the cabin, Tala had shifted her son's blanket and lifted him upright so he could lean against her chest. The boy's eyes opened wider now, reacting to sound and movement, and the sight gave Tala a moment of stability she had not felt in months. Silas set the pail beside the table, watching the child with the quiet scrutiny of a man who took every sign seriously. The boy's breathing was still shallow, but the fever's grip had loosened. It didn't mean safety. Not yet, but the danger no longer sat on the edge of immediate loss. "You want to try the breeze?" Silas asked. Tala nodded. "He needs light," she said. "Clean air, no dust." Silas considered her request, then carried the blanket outside to the small patch of ground near the fence where the morning wind slipped through the grass without stirring much dirt. He checked the sky for signs of weather and inspected the ground for anything that might agitate the child. Satisfied, he returned inside. "Bring him out," he said. "That spot stays cool until noon." Tala gathered her son carefully. Every movement was slow, controlled, deliberate. She followed Silas out the door and stepped onto the dirt yard, pausing to scan the horizon, an instinct born from traveling alone for too long. Only after confirming the land was empty did she kneel and lower her child onto the blanket. The boy blinked at the light, his face twitching in confusion. Tala rested a hand on his shoulder, whispering something soft in Apache, and he relaxed enough to focus on the pale sky above him. Silas crouched a few feet away, arms resting on his knees, watching the child's reactions. He wasn't used to this position, close, involved, responsible, but the attachment had formed without his permission. He caught himself thinking about what the coming days might demand of him, and pushed the thought aside before it grew heavier. Tala observed him quietly. She had been studying him since the moment she stepped onto his land, evaluating every gesture, every pause, every shift and expression. Now that her son was stable enough to rest without immediate danger, she finally addressed the offer she had made the day before. "You never answered me," she said, her voice steady but edged with something cautious. Silas didn't look at her right away. He reached for a small twig and broke it between his fingers, giving himself a moment before responding. "I chose not to," he said simply. Tala held his gaze. "You refuse. I don't take payment for doing what any man should do," Silas replied. Her brow tightened. Not in anger, confusion. "That is not what I saw in the world," she said. "Women alone are traded, taken, pushed. Every man asks for something. You ask for nothing. That makes no sense." Silas understood the bluntness. She wasn't accusing him. She was trying to understand him. "You offered out of fear," he said. Fear shouldn't bind anyone. Not you. Not him. He nodded toward the child. Saving him wasn't a bargain. It was the right thing. Tala absorbed the words carefully, as if weighing their truth. Her experiences told her one thing. The man in front of her demonstrated another. The contradiction unsettled her more than she expected. "You don't want me," she said, testing his sincerity. Silas looked directly at her now. "What you offered wasn't real choice. That's not something a man should take." The air between them tightened. Tala hadn't anticipated a rejection shaped from respect rather than avoidance. She searched his face for deception or hidden motives, but all she found was steady restraint, an unfamiliar kind of strength. Her fingers curled slightly in the dirt. "You think I am weak?" "No," Silas answered without hesitation. "You carried him across land most men wouldn't survive. You're tired, not weak." The statement hit her harder than anything he'd said yet. Strength was something she never allowed to be acknowledged. Not since losing her husband and moving through territory where being alone turned every day into negotiation for safety. Silas shifted his weight. "You can stay until he's strong," he said. "After that, you decide what comes next." Tala blinked once, slowly, processing the reality of choice, something she hadn't been offered since before the skirmish that took her husband. "My life has not had choices," she said quietly. "Only escape or danger. Never staying." Silas looked toward the distant ridge, avoiding the sharpness of her confession. "Then let this place be different," he said. "At least for now." Tala lowered her gaze to her son. The boy reached for her fingers, curling his small hand around hers with surprising strength. That small gesture made her exhale shakily, understanding how close she had come to losing him. Silas stood and walked back toward the cabin, giving her space to think. Inside, he filled a pot with water to heat for cleaning and set out a few supplies for whatever the day might bring. He wasn't sure how long she needed to stay or how the coming days would unfold. He only knew she and the boy were no longer strangers passing through. They were part of his land now, part of the quiet he had guarded for years. Outside, Tala watched her son breathe in the morning air. She looked toward the cabin door where Silas had disappeared and felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not relief, not safety, but the early shape of trust. A feeling she wasn't ready to name, but couldn't ignore. And the day had only just begun. The sun climbed slowly above the ridge, casting a soft, even light across Silas Ward's yard by the time the child stirred for the second time that morning. Tala had kept him outside on the blanket with a faint breeze moved across the grass, and each hour brought a new sign of strength. His eyes stayed open longer. His fingers grasped more firmly. His breathing no longer scraped against his chest. Silas stepped out of the cabin, carrying a bowl of cooled broth he had prepared before dawn. He sat on the ground beside Tala and crouched to study the boy's color. "He's gaining ground," Silas said, eyes narrowing with careful observation. Tala nodded, but didn't loosen her grip on the child's hand. The fear of relapse lingered behind her calm expression. It wasn't distrust of Silas. It was the memory of how quickly life had slipped away from those she loved. Silas sat back on one knee and lifted the boy just enough to help him sip. The child swallowed with more effort than ease, but the simple act held weight neither adult ignored. When the boy pushed the spoon away weakly, Silas adjusted his hold and let him rest. Tala's eyes softened, her shoulders dropping for the first time in days. "He listens again," she whispered. Silas gave a short nod. "That's a good sign." The boy leaned against Tala's chest, blinking at the yard as if seeing distance for the first time since arriving. Silas noticed the way he focused on the horses tied near the corral, then on the fence posts, then on the shifting grass. Awareness had returned. Silas stood and wiped his hands on his trousers. If he could stay awake a bit longer, he should try sitting on his own. Tala adjusted her position and guided her son upright. The boy trembled but held his weight with her support. Then, unexpectedly, he reached one foot forward. Tala froze, not wanting to push him too quickly. Silas watched intently, ready to intervene if the child faltered. "Let him find his balance," he advised. The boy took another small step onto the blanket, his knees shaking from weakness but not collapsing. Tala caught her breath at the sight. After days of fever that hovered between life and death, standing was something she didn't dare hope for. "He wants the fence," Silas observed, noticing the boy's gaze locked onto the nearest post. Tala hesitated, but the boy tugged her hand toward it. "Slow," she murmured, guiding him gently. They moved together, Tala bent low, the boy leaning heavily on her arm. Silas followed, several steps behind, prepared to act if the child stumbled. Morning light glinted off the fence rails, and the air smelled faintly of dry earth warming under the sun. The boy reached the post and placed his palm against the rough wood. He didn't hold himself upright fully, but he pressed enough weight to show intent. It was the first solid step he'd taken since collapsing on the edge of the property. Tala let out a shaky exhale she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "He stands," she whispered. "He truly stands." Silas looked away briefly, not wanting her to see the emotion rising behind his usually steady expression. The sight brought old memories of men he couldn't save, but here he had helped pull a life back from the edge. It shook something inside him he didn't want to examine closely. Tala turned to Silas. "You did this," she said, "not as praise, but as fact." Silas shook his head. "He did. I only helped him along." The boy leaned against the post, eyes heavy but peaceful. Tala lowered herself beside him, letting him rest against her shoulder. Her posture had shifted, not tense, not defensive, but protective with a softness that came only when fear loosened its grip. Silas stepped forward and checked the boy's temperature again, his hand steady on the child's forehead. The heat had dropped noticeably since dawn. "He'll tire fast," Silas said. "He needs quiet now." Tala gathered her son and carried him back to the blanket. Once settled, the boy curled into her side and drifted into a deep sleep, his breathing even and unstrained. Tala stroked his hair, her expression filled with exhaustion matched by relief. Silas sat a short distance away, resting his back against a fence rail. He removed his hat, wiped the sweat from his brow, and watched the two of them in silence. Tala broke that silence after several minutes. "You saved me too," she said softly. "Not just him." Silas looked down at the dust between his boots. "That wasn't the aim," he replied. "Maybe not," she answered, "but it happened." Neither spoke after that. The quiet between them wasn't tense anymore. It carried something steadier, an understanding neither had intended to build. A new sound rose from the field, birds moving through the grass, rustling faintly as they searched for seed. It was the first natural noise Tala had noticed since arriving, a reminder that the world outside fear still existed. Silas rose slowly. "I'll start work on the corral," he said. "I'll stay close if you need anything." Tala nodded, watching him walk toward the horses with calm, deliberate steps. She turned her attention back to her son, who slept with a steady rhythm that brought her peace she had nearly forgotten how to feel. This morning had changed everything. The child stood. He walked. He lived. And though they didn't speak it aloud, both adults understood that the connection forged through the long night and fragile morning wasn't fading. It was deepening. The day warmed steadily as the sun climbed higher, settling into the kind of heat that pressed against the skin without burning. By noon, the boy was sleeping peacefully in the shade outside the cabin, wrapped in a clean blanket Silas had brought out earlier. His breathing held a steady rhythm, neither hurried nor shallow, and the color in his cheeks had deepened enough to show real recovery. Tala watched him for a long time without moving. Her face carried a mixture of pride and dread, because she knew what the next step demanded. The moment her son was strong enough to travel, she would owe Silas an answer about her departure, a decision that had weighed on her since dawn. Silas stood near the corral, repairing a broken plank. His hammer struck wood with slow, even taps, each sound echoing across the empty land. The sky above them stayed clear, no signs of riders or dust trails, but Tala's gaze drifted there again and again. Years of danger had trained her to expect pursuit long after the threat seemed gone. When Silas finished the repair, he returned to the cabin for water. As he reached for the dipper, he noticed Tala gathering her few belongings into a small bundle she had fashioned from a strip of cloth. The movement made him pause, hands suspended above the bucket. "You're planning to leave?" he said. His voice held no surprise, only a calm acknowledgement. Tala tied the bundle tightly, her fingers tugging the knot with practiced firmness. "My son is safe enough to travel. He cannot stay here forever," she replied, not meeting his eyes. Silas set the dipper aside and crossed his arms loosely, studying her expression. "This place isn't pushing you out," he said. "You know that." She looked up then, her posture stiffening. "I cannot take your roof and your work without giving something in return. In my world, nothing is free. I owe you more than I can repay." Silas stepped closer, but kept his distance respectful. "You owe me nothing," he said firmly. "Not yesterday. Not now." Tala held his gaze, trying to measure truth against fear. "I offered myself. You said nothing. You refused to decide." "I decided," Silas corrected. "I'm not taking what was spoken out of desperation." The words hit her harder than she expected. Not because he refused, she had lived with refusal before, but because he valued her dignity in a way she did not understand. After months of navigating danger alone, she had no map for a man who expected nothing in return. Tala swallowed, her throat tightening. "You do not know me," she said quietly. "You do not know what I had to become to keep him alive. I cannot walk away without." "You can't," Silas interrupted gently. "And you will, if that's what you choose." Silas's tone carried something she had never heard from a man offering shelter, consent without conditions. It left her unbalanced, unsure where to place her defenses when no threat pressed against them. She looked toward her son, asleep beneath the shade. "Travel is dangerous," she murmured. "More dangerous now that he is weak." Silas followed her gaze. "He needs rest. Good food. Clean air. You've both pushed yourselves too hard." Tala hesitated. "My people, they will not come looking. But others might." Silas nodded. "The land isn't empty. But I haven't seen tracks near here for days." She listened, absorbing his assessment as if weighing it against her instincts. She understood danger better than most. Yet Silas's words carried the kind of measured certainty that came from years of reading the land. Still, she lifted her bundle. "I must leave before anyone else finds us." Silas stepped back, giving her space. "You're free to go," he said, "but don't leave because you think you're a burden. You're not." Tala tightened her grip on the bundle until her knuckles turned white. The sincerity in his voice unsettled her more than the threat of strangers. "Burden or not," she began, but her voice trailed off as the emotion she had suppressed all morning resurfaced. Silas didn't move closer. He didn't reach for her. He didn't argue. He waited. Tala drew a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "If I stay," she said slowly, "I take more from you. Food, water, space, protection." Silas shook his head. "You and the boy have taken nothing I can't give." Tala felt something shift in her chest, a breaking of an old belief she had carried since losing her husband, that survival always required paying a price. Silas was offering something different, safety without demand. "Your brother died," she said cautiously, recalling the small detail he had shared earlier. "You survived that. Why open your door to strangers now?" Silas's jaw tightened. "Because I've seen what happens when a man turns his back on someone who needs help," he said. "I won't repeat those mistakes." Tala studied him, reading the heaviness behind the words. They carried regret, but also resolve. Her fingers loosened on the bundle. Slowly, she lowered it to the ground. "I do not know how to live in a place that gives without taking," she admitted. "Then learn it here," Silas said quietly. The honesty in his tone struck something deep within her, something raw, something unguarded. She didn't step closer, but her posture softened as if a long tensed muscle finally released. Tala turned toward her son. "I stay only until he gains his full strength," she said, setting an invisible boundary she needed in order to breathe. Silas nodded once. "That's enough." The conversation ended there, not through dismissal, but through mutual understanding. Tala gathered the blanket around her son and brushed his hair away from his forehead. Silas returned to his work with steady movements, giving her time to adjust. The threat of departure had passed, replaced by a fragile but genuine decision to remain. Not as a debtor, not as a captive, but as a mother choosing safety over fear, at least for now. Neither realized yet how deeply this choice would reshape their lives. The next morning came with a quiet that felt different from the days before. It wasn't the strained silence of fear or the tense stillness of survival. It carried a slow ease, the kind that settled into the spaces between breath and movement. The boy woke with steady eyes and enough strength to push himself upright without leaning heavily against Tala. That alone altered the air around the cabin. Tala guided him outside, one hand steady on his back as they stepped into the open yard. The sun hovered low on the horizon, washing the land in a warm, early light that softened the hard lines of the fence posts and the rugged brush beyond. The boy walked 3 uneven steps before Tala stopped him, wanting to test his strength without draining it. Silas watched from the porch with his arms crossed loosely, ready to intervene, but choosing not to break the moment. His face held a rare hint of relief, subtle, controlled, but present. He had seen too many lives fade to take progress for granted, yet the boy's improvement stirred something inside him he hadn't felt in years. Tala looked around the property with a focus not driven by fear this time, but by evaluation. She was observing the land through a different lens, no longer searching for threats alone, but studying what could support survival if she remained here longer than planned. Her eyes followed the line of the horizon, scanning the empty basin, then drifted to the ridge where sunlight glinted off distant rocks. "No riders," she said quietly, half to herself. Silas stepped down from the porch and approached slowly. "I'll walk the perimeter at dawn," he said. "No tracks, no smoke, nothing moving within a mile." Tala nodded, accepting his assessment without question. For the first time, she seemed willing to rely on his experience rather than solely her instincts. The boy tugged lightly on her hand and pointed toward the corral where Silas's horses stood. "He remembers them," Silas remarked. Tala looked down at her son. "He likes animals," she said. "They were the only safe things where we lived before." Silas understood more than she realized. Children fleeing violence often clung to any creature that did not harm them. He crouched near the boy and lowered his voice. "You want to see them?" The child nodded faintly. Tala hesitated. Her son was stronger, yes, but the corral meant movement, unpredictable animals, and exposure. She lifted her chin slightly, assessing the risk, then gave a small, cautious nod. Silas led them across the yard with slow steps. He approached the closest gelding, the calmer of the two, and kept a hand on the reins while the boy reached out. The horse lowered its head, sniffing curiously before allowing the child's frail fingers to brush against its nose. The boy's face shifted with a spark of interest Silas hadn't seen before. It wasn't full excitement, but it was the earliest sign of curiosity, a step beyond survival. Tala watched the interaction closely, her posture tense at first, then slowly loosening as she saw her child respond without fear. This land, once a strange and threatening place, now held a piece of safety she hadn't imagined possible. Silas straightened and stepped back to give him space. "He's connecting," he said. "That's good for him." Tala brushed her fingers over her son's hair, keeping him close. "He hasn't felt safe in a long time," she admitted. "Not since before his father died." Silas didn't press for details. He sensed the wound behind those words and respected the boundary she placed around it. The morning continued with a rhythm neither of them expected. The boy walked small circles around the yard, leaning on Tala less with each step. Silas repaired a section of the fence, occasionally glancing toward them, never intruding but always aware. Tala noticed the pattern. "You check on us without stepping close," she said later, her tone more curious than critical. Silas shrugged slightly. "Some folks need space more than comfort." She considered that answer carefully. "I'm not used to being given space," she said. Most men crowded close to take what they wanted. Silas's expression darkened briefly, not from discomfort, but from anger at the idea. "You won't see that here," he said. "Not from me." Tala held his gaze. "I know." The simple acknowledgement carried weight. It marked the first time she openly expressed trust toward him. The wind shifted in the afternoon, blowing gently across the field and carrying the scent of sun-warmed earth. Tala stood near the fence with her son leaning against her leg, and she glanced toward the cabin, toward the open door, toward the place where she had slept beside fear and hope. "This land, it feels different today," she said quietly. Silas stepped up beside her, keeping one arm's length of respectful distance. "Because you're not waiting to run," he replied. Tala took a deep breath, letting the truth settle. "For the first time in months," she said, "I woke without expecting danger at the door." Silas nodded once, a slow, deliberate gesture that matched the gravity of her words. "You're safe here," he said. "You and the boy, as long as you need." The afternoon light stretched across the yard, painting long, thin shadows. The boy rested in Tala's arms, his breathing steady as sleep overtook him again. Tala adjusted the blanket around him, her movements filled with a tenderness untouched by panic for the first time since arriving. And Silas, watching her hold her son with quiet strength, realized something he hadn't let himself consider. He no longer saw them as travelers passing through. They were becoming part of the place he had once built to keep everyone out. The land felt wider now, no longer empty, no longer just his. Something unspoken had shifted, and neither of them dared name it yet. The following days carried a new rhythm across Silas Ward's land, a rhythm he had never expected to share with anyone again. Tala remained near the cabin with her son, tending to him with a focus sharpened by fear, but slowly reshaped into something calmer. The boy regained strength in small waves, longer steps, clearer eyes, steadier breaths, and each improvement altered the mood inside the cabin. Silas adjusted to their presence with quiet ease. He rose earlier than usual, driven not by habit alone, but by an unfamiliar sense of responsibility. Before the sun climbed above the ridge, he was already checking the water supply, preparing a small meal, and securing the yard for the day. He didn't announce these tasks or invite acknowledgement. He simply carried them out, aware that Tala and the boy depended on stability more than words. Inside the cabin, Tala wiped the table with a damp cloth, removing dust collected overnight. She glanced toward the window every few minutes, her instincts still sharp, but the tension in her shoulders no longer dominated her movements. She was learning how the land breathed, its patterns, its quiet moments, its reassuring stillness. Her son sat on the floor, sorting wooden buttons Silas had given him, touching each one with slow precision. His legs trembled when he tried standing without support, but the improvement was steady. Tala watched him closely, ready to catch him if he fell, though the boy's confidence grew faster than her comfort allowed. Silas stepped through the doorway, carrying a stack of split logs. "I'll be fixing the window frame today," he said, nodding toward the loose boards near the east wall. "Wind slips through there at night." Tala paused her cleaning and assessed the gap. "I felt it," she said. "Cold air touches his feet." "I'll seal it," Silas replied. Their exchanges were brief but clear, practical communication shaped by necessity, not avoidance. Silas respected silence. Tala understood it. Neither struggled to fill empty space. Silas set the logs by the stove and retrieved his tools. As he worked, the sound of his hammering mingled with the soft murmurs Tala used to guide her son's movements. The boy reached for her fingers to help himself stand, and when he managed a few steps on his own, Tala's breath caught in her chest, relief paired with a new, fragile hope she had almost forgotten how to feel. Silas paused his work for a moment, watching from the corner of his eye. "He's steady," he said. "Not strong yet, but steady." Tala shifted her son onto her hip, examining his posture with the same seriousness she used for assessing danger. "He learns fast," she answered. "He always has." Silas nodded once, returning to his task. "He'll be running circles around us soon enough." The faintest smile touched Tala's face, a small, cautious expression that vanished as quickly as it appeared. But Silas saw it. He didn't comment. He simply held the moment quietly. By midday, the window frame was reinforced and the drafts that used to slip through were gone. Tala tested the edge herself, running her fingers along the board to check for gaps. "You work with care," she said. I work so things last, Silas replied. Tala understood the deeper meaning. He built things to endure because so much in his life had not. Later, while Tala prepared a simple stew using dried vegetables and herbs she found near the creek, Silas cleaned his tools at the table. The boy sat between them, leaning against a cushion, watching both adults with quiet curiosity. The room felt lived in, not crowded, not tense, but shared. You cook often? Silas asked without looking up. Tala stirred the pot and answered plainly. When there is food, she said. When there is not, I make broth from bones. Silas felt a silent stab of respect for her resilience. You're safe from hunger here, he said. There's plenty to work with. Tala didn't respond immediately. She listened to the steady boil of the pot, breathing in the unfamiliar sense of security. This place, it does not feel like danger, she admitted. Not anymore. Silas looked at her for a moment, the firelight catching the worn edges of his expression. That's how it should be, he said. After they ate, Tala stepped outside to rinse the bowls. The evening light stretched long across the yard, painting the ground in warm tones. Her son stood near the porch, gripping the rail for balance. Silas lingered a few steps away, keeping watch without hovering. Tala noticed. You guard without saying, she said. Silas shrugged lightly. Old habits. Good ones, she replied. Her son managed 3 steps towards Silas, wobbling but determined. Silas lowered himself to one knee, letting the boy press a hand against his shoulder for support. It was the first time the child had reached for him without Tala guiding the movement. Tala watched the moment with a complex mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. He trusts you, she said quietly. I trust him, Silas answered. The confession surprised her. She had grown used to men who trusted no one, especially women and children who came with their own burdens. But Silas's world operated by a different set of rules, one she was slowly learning to understand. As dusk settled, Silas lit the lamp inside the cabin. Tala tucked her son into the bed nearest the stove, ensuring the warmth stayed even through the night. She moved with a tired grace, her body adjusting to a life not defined by constant threat. Silas watched from the doorway, taking in the scene. The blanket pulled tight, the child's calm breathing, Tala's hand resting lightly against his leg. The cabin looked different tonight. It wasn't just a shelter. It felt inhabited. Silas stepped inside and closed the door gently so the draft wouldn't disturb the boy. For the first time since Tala and her child arrived, the space did not feel temporary. It felt like the beginning of something they all needed, though none of them had the courage to name it yet. The next morning brought a stillness that felt earned rather than forced. The sun rose slowly over the ridge, spreading a soft warmth across Silas Ward's land. Birds moved through the brush with deliberate motions, not startled, not hurried, just part of the quiet rhythm that had settled over the property since Tala and her son arrived. Inside the cabin, the boy woke early and pushed himself upright without help. His legs wobbled, but he stayed standing long enough to draw Tala from her light sleep. She sat up immediately, scanning his face for signs of strain, but what she saw instead was determination, clear, steady, and stronger than anything he'd shown before. Silas, already outside splitting kindling, heard the faint laughter from inside, a small sound, but the first of its kind since they had come to his land. He lowered the axe and let the moment wash over him before wiping his hands on his trousers and stepping back toward the cabin. Tala opened the door just as he reached it. She supported her son at the hip, but the boy's weight rested evenly now, not dragging her down as it once had. He wants to walk the yard, she said, a soft disbelief coloring her tone. Silas stepped aside. Then let's see what he's ready for. They crossed the yard together, the boy holding Tala's hand, while Silas remained only a few steps behind, ready but not intruding. The child took 5 steps alone before reaching for the fence. His fingers curled around the rail as he steadied himself, and then he looked back at Silas with a small, confident grin. Silas returned the expression, subtle, brief, but real. You're getting ahead of us, he said. Tala watched the exchange with a warmth she had never allowed herself to feel in the open. Her son's survival had taken every part of her strength for months. leaving no room for anything but fear and movement. But now, fear wasn't the only thing shaping her decisions. As the boy explored the yard, touching fence posts and studying the corral with refreshed curiosity, Silas moved toward Tala. "He's stronger than I expected," Silas said. "He has always been strong," she replied. "He only needed a place that did not push him into the ground." Silas nodded slowly, recognizing the truth and the weight behind it. As the morning wore on, Tala cooked a small meal inside the cabin, while Silas taught the boy how to tap the ground with a short stick to test for holes or snakes. The child copied Silas's movements carefully, watching every motion with the same seriousness he once used to cling to survival. Tala stood in the doorway, observing the two of them, her son learning, Silas teaching. The sight stirred something inside her, something she couldn't deny any longer. When Silas noticed her watching, he lowered the stick and walked toward her. "You're thinking about something," he said quietly. "I am," she admitted. She looked down at her hands, unsure where to begin. "I plan to leave when he recovered," she said. "That was the promise I made myself." Silas waited. He didn't step closer. He didn't offer reassurance. He let her speak at her own pace. But now, she looked at her son, who was tracing patterns in the dirt with his stick. "I see him breathing freely. I see him learning. I see him safe." Silas felt a pull in his chest, not painful, but heavy with something he had avoided for years. Hope mixed with responsibility. "That's what matters," he said. Tala lifted her eyes to his. "I thought leaving was the only way to protect him," she said. "But walking away from this place does not feel like protection anymore." Silas held her gaze, saying nothing. He didn't dare influence her decision. She continued, her voice steadier than before. "You refused my offer. You gave us shelter freely. You did not ask from me what others demanded. That made me see this land differently." Silas exhaled slowly. "You don't owe me a reason to stay," he said. "But if you do, it will be your choice, not a debt." Tala looked at the cabin, the fence, the open land, then back at her son, who now tried to balance on one foot near the corral. "I want him to grow where he is not hunted," she said, "where the wind does not carry danger every hour." Silas nodded once. "He can have that here." Tala stepped closer, only one small step, but enough to show she was no longer measuring distance out of fear. "And she paused, gathering her courage. "I want to stay too." Silas felt the words settle inside him with surprising clarity. "You're welcome," he said, his voice low. "Both of you." There was no ceremony, no declaration, no dramatic gesture. "I see him safe." Silas felt a pull in his chest, not painful, but heavy with something he had avoided for years. Hope mixed with responsibility. "That's what matters," he said. Tala lifted her eyes to his. "I thought leaving was the only way to protect him," she said. "But walking away from this place does not feel like protection anymore." Silas held her gaze, saying nothing. He didn't dare influence her decision. She continued, her voice steadier than before. "You refused my offer. You gave us shelter freely. You did not ask from me what others demanded. Just an unspoken agreement that reshaped the direction of all three lives." The boy ran toward Tala then, stumbling into her arms with a burst of energy that made her laugh. A sound Silas had never heard from her before. It filled the yard with something warm and unmistakable. Silas watched them, the hammer still tucked in his belt, the morning sun catching the edges of his coat. He felt a shift, not in the land but in himself. A weight he had carried since his brother's death loosened, replaced by something steadier, something rooted. Tala lifted her son onto her hip and turned toward Silas. "We will make a life here," she said, "if you want us." Silas stepped closer, his voice firm and certain. "I do." The boy reached out and touched Silas's arm as if sealing the decision. Silas placed his hand gently over the small fingers. Together, they walked back toward the cabin. The woman who had arrived begging for her child's life, the boy who had nearly died at the door, and the man who had believed he was meant to live alone forever. The cabin did not feel empty anymore. The land no longer felt quiet out of loneliness. The future no longer felt closed. What began in desperation had become a home, built not from fear or debt, but from choice, respect, and the promise of belonging. And for the first time in years, Silas Ward stepped inside his cabin knowing he was no longer alone.